When I was a child, I loved the idea of World Communion Sunday. In my Presbyterian church, it was a time to sing hymns from other countries and learn about Christians and other cultures, as Reverend Elizabeth was teaching our children today. Maybe we'd have some breads from around the world on our communion table, as we do today. I love the idea of World Communion Sunday because I love the idea of sharing my identity, my Christian identity, with people who didn't speak my language or look like me or live like me. It gave me a sense of belonging to something bigger than me and my family and my community, bigger even than my country. When I became a youth in mission in the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan while I was in college, my abstract ideas about this worldwide communion of Christians became very real. Christian unity took on flesh and blood as Christians on the other side of the world welcomed me into their homes, treated me like a sister, and trusted me implicitly, simply because I shared their faith. I sat through countless worship services without understanding one word. But when it came time to bow our heads in prayer or stand up to sing or to receive communion, I knew what we were doing and why. Our faith gave us a common language and sense of identity, a sense of being family. Now, at the same time that I was enjoying this almost mystical sense of communion with people so different than me, I was also painfully aware of divisions among Christians closer to home. At my Southern Baptist College in South Carolina, many of my classmates disagreed with me on fundamental questions like whether or not I, as a woman, could be called to ordained ministry. And even on fundamental facts about things like the impact and legacy of slavery on African Americans and the impacts and ongoing realities of racism. And lurking underneath all of those troubling disagreements was the one I dared not even name, the nearly universal belief among Christians of that era that homosexuality was most certainly a sin. Well, I still love World Communion Sunday, and I still want to celebrate it, but it's not an abstraction anymore like it was when I was a child. Today, I know, for example, that Christianity in Taiwan has done tremendous good. And I also know that it was brought there by British and North American missionaries who didn't have much respect for Chinese culture and did some harm along the way. Today, I know that I often feel a greater sense of belonging with people of other faiths who share my values than with Christians who don't. And on this particular World Communion Sunday, friends, I am struggling. I am struggling to enjoy a sense of unity in Christ with Christians in our country who are making me angry. Christians across our land who may claim to worship the same God I do, but whose faith looks very different than mine when applied to real world problems and issues. Problems like sexual assault, rape culture, and white supremacy. So I have a problem today. My problem is how to celebrate World Communion Sunday when I often don't get along with Christians who live next door to me or are even in my own extended family. If you can relate to this problem, our text from 2 Corinthians presents us with a challenge. From now on, therefore, we regard no one from a human point of view. In Christ, Paul says, we become a new creation. God acts through Jesus to repair our broken relationship with God. But then God does something even more radical. God trusts us with the ministry of reconciliation. And when you read the rest of Paul's letters, you know that Paul's not just talking about reconciliation with God, but reconciliation with one another, even with people who are our enemies. For real, our enemies. For that's who was pouring into the churches that Paul was founding across the Mediterranean world. People who in the broader society around them were at enmity with one another. Gentiles and Jews, slaves and masters. But somehow within these small Christian communities, they became friends and equals. Even women, universally subjugated in the ancient cultures of the day, rose to positions of leadership and authority, becoming co-workers with Paul and the other apostles, despite what my biblically literalist friends in college would argue. In her book, Seeing, Remembering, and Connecting, Subversive Practices of Being Church, Karen Bloomquist talks about a connectedness that is reconciliation. She explores this miracle of reconciliation in the early church. That was a place where Jewish Christians were welcoming in agents of the very empire that was oppressing them. Together, she says, these congregations produced a movement for social unity across divides of culture, tradition, class, and race. This miracle of reconciliation meant that loyalty to the practices of empire was replaced with a consciousness of being in Christ and a different set of practices. Imagine, she says, by becoming part of these faith communities, Romans and Greeks were identifying with Jews, a socially stigmatized people. And Gentiles were learning by their communion with these Jewish Christians what marginalization within the empire meant. Well, how were these early Christians able to experience this miracle of reconciliation and lay aside the practices of empire to embrace a radical communion with the marginalized? They had only to look at the example of Jesus, whose life and ministry still reverberated in the living memory of the founders of these churches. In his own context of Jewish Palestine, Jesus practiced radical communion with those on the margins of his culture and religion. We see him in today's reading from Matthew, sharing a meal with social outcasts and calling people who were Roman collaborators to be his followers. I call this radical communion because Jesus' habit of eating with social outcasts made him a target for all who were invested in the status quo. Religious and social elites became furious with Jesus for breaking spoken and unspoken rules of who you socialized with, who you ate with, and who you treated as your equal. But you know what? If you read the Gospels carefully, you can see that Jesus got angry too. Jesus got angry. Although he was committed to nonviolence, he could be sharp-tongued when he needed to be, and he did not shy away from calling people to account. Jesus understood what feminist ethicist Beverly Harrison called the power of anger in the work of love. I was deeply blessed to have Beverly Harrison as one of my 2 doctoral advisors at Union Theological Seminary in the 90s. Her essay, The Power of Anger in the Work of Love, was revelatory for me personally, because I had been raised in a good Protestant home, which was all about repressing anger. And it was revelatory for a whole generation of ethicists. And it came back to me this week as I was listening to an NPR interview with a woman named Rebecca Traister, whose recent book, Good and Mad, The Revolutionary Power of Women's Anger, is getting some attention this week. Traister has documented ways in which women's anger has been a force for transformation in our society and across generations. And that reminded me of Bev Harrison and that essay. And it got me wondering, what if we could acknowledge on this World Communion Sunday that Christians may be more divided right now than we are united? What if we could admit that many of us are angry at each other? What difference would it make to come to this communion table recognizing that anger, acknowledging it, and finding in it, and this is the revolutionary part, something that serves love rather than destroying it? Could it be? For that was the revolutionary insight of Bev Harrison, rooted in the life and practices of Jesus, that anger actually has a critical role to play in the work of love, or as Paul would say, in the ministry of reconciliation. And so on this Sunday, when I feel suspended somewhere between rage and depression at what has been happening in our country, when I come to this table wanting to feel united with all Christians everywhere, but instead feeling suspicious and afraid, I would like to offer you some words that I think should be in our modern canon, the ongoing revelation of our still speaking God in the words of a sister in Christ, Beverly Wildung Harrison. And so from the power of anger in the work of love, listen. It is my thesis, Harrison writes, that we Christians have come very close to killing love, precisely because anger has been understood as a deadly sin. Anger is not the opposite of love. It is better understood as a feeling signal that all is not well in our relation to other persons or groups or the world around us. Anger is a mode of connectedness to others, and it is always a vivid form of caring. To put the point another way, anger is, and it always is, a sign of some resistance in ourselves to the moral quality of the social relations in which we are immersed. We must never lose touch, she says, with the fact that all serious human moral activity, especially action for social change, takes its bearings from the rising power of human anger, Such anger is a signal that change is called for, that transformation in relation is required. Our fear of the power of anger, Bev continues, masks itself as boredom, ennui, low energy, or it expresses itself in passive-aggressive activity or moralistic self-righteousness and blaming. The important point is that where feeling is evaded, where anger is hidden or goes unattended, there the power of love, the power to act, atrophies and dies. In other words, reconciliation, according to Bev Harrison, is not possible unless we first come to terms with our anger at what is disrupting right relationship. At the same time, we ourselves need to become willing to hear the anger of others for the way in which we are complicit in systems of injustice that are strangling them. Harrison ends her revolutionary essay with a warning and a promise. A warning and a promise that speak to me, and I hope to you also, on this World Communion Sunday. She writes, "We live in a time when massive and accumulated injustice acted out over time encounters an answer in the rising anger of those whose dignity and life are being threatened by collective patterns of privilege which have to be undone." In the midst of this awful and awesome time, Harrison concludes, a chief evidence of the grace of God, which always comes to us in, with, and through each other, is this power to struggle and to experience indignation. We should not make light of our power to rage against the dying of the light. It is the root of the power of love. Sisters and brothers, on this day of all days, do not make light of your power to rage against the dying of the light. Whatever righteous anger is arising within you at injustice, channel it into the work of love, remembering with humility that our own hearts also need transformation. For we too are being made into a new creation. Thanks be to God. Amen.